So we've just seen the US pardoning thousands of people federally. Do you have any idea of the number of people who have cannabis convictions for possession or use here?
Yeah, we do. So Ministry of Justice stats tell us that since 1980, 120,000 New Zealanders have been convicted for possession or use of cannabis in this country. So that's 120,000 New Zealanders who are currently walking around who have those convictions for a drug that 80% of New Zealanders will use by the time that they're out of their teenage years. And if that is not an indication of just how broken this law is, then we'll get into it.
And what limitations does that place on those people?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously those who are in favour of the status quo will say, oh, well, those people aren't going to prison. Well, yeah, sure, not all of them are, but the reality is that those convictions are an impediment to employment, to housing, to travel and to future opportunities. We heard from the Minister yesterday saying that, oh, well, you know, the Clean Slate Act exists. Yeah, sure, but again, it's a rigmarole that certain people who end up getting these convictions have to go through, which is fundamentally inequitable when you look at the stats, particularly disproportionately when it's Māori being prosecuted. Those who do end up being prosecuted for a substance that the majority of New Zealanders use. 635,000 Kiwis were using cannabis last year alone.
So I just want to talk to you really briefly before we get into the nitty-gritty of how what Joe Biden is doing in the US may translate here. But the Clean Slate Act, for example, would that solve this problem for many of those people?
Well, yeah, when you're talking about, again, simple possession, but things obviously get a little bit more muddied when you're talking about the fact that possession offences are often being paired with other offences. However, we do know that in the last 2 years, when you are pairing possession and use offences of substances, particularly cannabis, with those other offences, that possession is the highest drug offence that they are being charged for. So again, when you're muddying the waters and pairing all of those offences together, again, it gets a little bit difficult to disentangle. So sure, there are some ways that people can have those issues resolved through the likes of the Clean Slate Act. And then you'll hear from the Minister saying that the 2019 legislation that we got through, amending the Misuse of Drugs Act, which entrenches police discretion, something which I fought really hard for and the Greens fought really hard for in the wake of the synthetics crisis. Sure, that goes some way to addressing the reality of what was already happening on the front lines and saying the police are allowed to use their discretion and divert people. But again, what we're seeing is that discretion enables and opens the door to discrimination. What we need is a law that says this is the baseline approach that we're going to take to all cannabis offences, to all drug offences, and particularly to possession. Because right now, who is benefiting from criminal prosecution of those with simple drug offences?
Well, I want to get to Andrew Little because he was quick onto Twitter yesterday.
We were all on Twitter yesterday, weren't we? Biden and...
Yeah, no, it exploded, that's right. And he was saying that the government here in New Zealand can't pardon people in the same way that Joe Biden can. So don't expect a similar move here in New Zealand, which is technically true, isn't it?
Look, technically there are kind of two ways that the government could go about it if they wanted to. One is a royal prerogative, and sure, that is a little bit complicated, but we do have precedent for its application. The other is an act of parliament. We have a sovereign parliament that is able to pass any legislation that it wants to and regularly does. You know, we're the fastest lawmakers in the West. So it very much is the case that if the government's kind of refrain is, hey, look, this is kind of already the practice, and we also heard from opposition members throughout the cannabis legalisation debate that even they think that decriminalisation should kind of be the status quo, then let's entrench that in law, because right now nobody is benefiting from this ad hoc approach and this very discriminatory approach to cannabis prosecution.
But there is just no political will for that, is there?
We're rallying, we're trying our best. I mean, look, talking to my colleagues in Te Pāti Māori, it appears as though we've got some consensus there, so I think there's at least 12 votes in our parliament that are keen on it, and it's been no secret that for the past few years subsequent to the referendum, because obviously the referendum, look, I'm the first to admit, had 34,000 people voted differently, then we would have had legal regulated cannabis in this country. They didn't, so let's grapple with that reality. So that means that specific niche prescription of how we could legally regulate cannabis failed. That doesn't take off the table harm reduction, evidence-based approaches to substances across the board, especially when dealing with the fundamentally broken Frankenstein of the Misuse of Drugs Act 1975. So we can do that.
But it does take off the table law changes politically.
It takes off the table a very prescribed way that we could go about legally regulating cannabis. It doesn't take off the table broader drug law reform. It would be nonsense for us to say that, you know, for example, the largest petition that was ever tabled in Parliament prior to this term was actually against homosexual law reform. times change, but also we can take different approaches where it's found out that people are not in favour of, again, a very specific proposed way that we could regulate something.
Yeah, did we miss an opportunity there to decriminalise? Was it too black and white? Legalise? Should there have been a decriminalise option in there as well?
Look, it was the best that could be negotiated at the time. I wasn't in the room. There were 3 parties in government, and what I do know is that there was a logjam, and I think people understandably can forget just how much we've moved on this issue in the last 5 years. You know, 5 years ago when I first came into Parliament and inherited the Medicinal Cannabis Amendment Bill from my colleague Julianne Genter, that was wild, that was radical, and then we had the government block voting that, we had National and New Zealand First block voting that down, and a number of Labour MPs deciding to also vote it down. Then we had the government passing their own, and again we saw that by virtue of taking that really pharmaceutical approach, that we have a status quo now that means that 94% of medicinal cannabis patients are still getting access through the black market. Yeah. Whichever way you look at it, this is not working for anyone.
I want to quickly talk to you very briefly because we're running out of time, but it's important too. Your bill on harm reduction for alcohol, banning advertising around it, it is due to come up soon. How are you getting the votes for that? Because it's a conscience vote for Labour, right?
It is. It should be a conscience vote for all parliamentarians. So I guess just to lay it out actually for the public, because it's a really interesting insight into how a democracy can or should work, and that's that you need 61 votes of 120 parliamentarians to pass any law. We have 12 guaranteed from the Greens, which means that from the Greens and Te Pāti Māori, which means that we need 49 more. Labour have 65, so we could lose 16 of them. And also, you know, it'd be great if National decided to work with their consciences, and I know I've been talking to a number of them who potentially we could see some movement, but I have been really encouraged by the engagement, particularly with the Labour Party backbench, who see this harm in their communities. This is one of the most straightforward things that we could do, the lowest hanging fruit, what I thought was going to be the least controversial, the most evidence-based. Give back local democracy to create local alcohol policies and restrict marketing for one of the most harmful substances, legal or illegal, that we know of.
OK, well, thank you so much for joining us here on The Nation this morning, Chloe Swarbrick.
Thank you.
We're Hari Akine.